I am speaking with our State Senator Bruce Tarr, as I do every week. Good afternoon, Senator. How are you today?
Good afternoon, Heather. I'm doing great today, and I hope you are as well.
I am. I know you had a busy week last week on the floor discussing the budget.
You know, the budget debate is probably the busiest week that we have every year in the state Senate and in the House when they debate the budget. It's their busiest week. So it's a really intense time, and it ended on Thursday in the afternoon. And I'm glad it's behind us. We had a vigorous debate, we had a good debate, and I think one that was very productive. And Heather, just to remind folks, there were 923 amendments roughly that were filed to a budget that spends over $47 billion. So when you talk about that, it's an intense exercise because A, you're spending a lot of money. B, we're in a very interesting time of pivoting out of the recession or at least the effects of the pandemic, which have not yet necessarily become recessionary, but we're pivoting from that and trying to rebuild the economy. And in the budget, you talk about a whole host of subjects. So there were, out of the 923 amendments, I filed about 109. And out of those 109, 29 of them passed. And so we talked about a lot of things. We got a lot of things accomplished. And sometimes budget amendments don't pass, but they set the stage for further discussion. And so I think it was a very, very productive week. And I think my colleagues generally feel the same way.
So let's review some of the amendments that you successfully passed.
Sure. So one thing I won't do is recite all 29 of them because I want folks' eyes to glaze over. But let's talk about a couple of them that I think are pretty important. One of them is something I've been working on for a very long time, and that is trying to get our regional school transportation rate of reimbursement to where it needs to be. So under the statute, it's supposed to be at 100%. And that was intended as an incentive for schools that regionalized to be able to have some help with the cost of transporting students over a larger area in a region. It never has been at 100%, but I've been working and my colleagues have been working to push it closer and closer and closer. And so this year, the Senate Ways and Means budget started at 90%, which shows significant progress over the last number of years. I wanted to push it a little further, and so I offered an amendment with tremendous co-sponsorship from both sides of the aisle, and we added another $1 million to that account. So that'll move us closer to that 100%, and I think it's very significant. We also were dealing with a whole host of other subjects, and one of those subjects was the fishing industry, and that's something that you and I talk about quite a bit, and it's important that we try to help the industry. And this year, the debate focused a lot on the fact that during the pandemic, we saw just how important local food supply chains are and why we need to protect them and make them stronger. So one of the first things we did was for the lobster industry. We all know what's been happening with regard to right whale closures, that this year went from February to mid-May when folks couldn't fish at all. So when we had asked the folks in the lobster industry what they'd like to see, their number one request was to have more patrols by the environmental police to monitor the whales and actually to keep vessels that are not commercial fishing vessels away from them to protect their safety, and also to remove so-called ghost fishing gear from the water. So this is old gear that just tends to roll in the ocean and has the potential for entanglement. Long story short, we're able to secure $250,000 for additional patrols by the environmental police to make sure to protect the right whales. And the lobster industry folk believe that that will help them a lot, because if we reduce right whale mortality and right whale entanglement, that will go a long way toward convincing the federal government and the courts that we don't need to have cumbersome regulations, at least any more of them, and hopefully will open up some more fishing opportunities. So that was a really important amendment, and it had unanimous support from the Senate, and I'm really pleased about that.
And it makes so much sense. I just have to
it's a great thing, and it helps conserve the stock because there are somewhere between 350 and 400 northern right whales left in the world. And hopefully we'll be able to drive those numbers up with more protection, but it also hopefully will prevent the extinction of the commercial lobster fishery. And just for folks that may not be as familiar with this, the reason these two things are linked is because the lobster traps have a line, a vertical line that connects to a buoy, and that is seen as a threat to entanglement because a whale could get tangled in that line. And so that's why fishing was shut down completely. Lobster fishing was shut down completely from February to May 15th. And thankfully that closure is now over. But if we don't continue to be proactive, not only will it reoccur, but it will become more extensive.
And it did feel like an incredible burden to place all the responsibility on the lobstermen.
There's no doubt about it. And it speaks volumes about them when asked about what they wanted to do to help. Their first response was, let's protect the right whale.
Right,
And,
right.
and that will help us be able to stay fishing. So really a win-win here. And hopefully, too, we'll be able to collect more data as those patrols are occurring. And again, it will be evolutionary and the system will get better.
Mm. So you want to name a few more of your 20
Sure.
past
So on the lines of food, one of the things that I was responsible for because I led the Senate working group during the pandemic on supply chain issues was food supply and making sure that we have a good chain of supply. And one of the things I learned through that experience was how much capacity we could have to produce more local food, but that capacity doesn't get put into play for various reasons. And so I offered an amendment that's relative to meat and poultry production because it turns out that we need more inspections and the federal government can't always get the inspections done. So new facilities can't necessarily open or added capacity to existing facilities. So I offered an amendment to give the Department of Agricultural Resources an additional $100,000 to be able to expand inspections and take advantage of a federal law which allows the state to inspect under certain conditions. And that inspection has the equivalence of a federal inspection so that those meat and poultry products can go into the stream of commerce. So that was another win that I think it reflects a lesson that we learned from the pandemic, but it will also serve us well going into the future.
That's great. And who knew that there were that state inspections were not allowed?
Well, they are allowed, but only under certain circumstances. And the things that are inspected can't go into the stream of commerce for the rest of us.
Mm.
And so we learned that there was a way to get that done, but we needed some additional resources to do it. So I think this $100,000 that hopefully we'll be spending, because we still have to get all of these items through the conference committee, but I'm hoping that this additional $100,000 will go a long way and make a huge difference to bolstering local production of meat and poultry products, which I think will be good for everyone.
It's amazing how much diversity is in this budget.
Well, it's reflective of a typical budget where it's the one vehicle that as a legislator, will pass. There needs to be a state budget. And so everyone tries to hit the buttons of their priorities to try to get them included into this document. And one of the hallmarks of this budget in particular was the amount of collaboration and dialogue that took place in terms of building the budget, both before it was released from the Ways and Means Committee, during the debate, and even after the debate in terms of making sure that we put together a good package that responds to a lot of priorities. And one thing, Heather, that I think is important that doesn't get recognized enough, and I tried to stress this during floor debate, is you did not see in this budget an increase in taxes or a complete depletion of the state stabilization fund. And those are things that don't get enough credit because we tend to focus on spending and we don't necessarily focus on fiscal discipline. But one thing that's important about the Senate version of the budget is that it leaves over $1 billion in the state stabilization fund. Now, we've got a long way to go to rebuild that because before the pandemic, it was at about $3.5 billion. So we need to rebuild that fund as quickly as possible. And I had a lot of discussions in Senate floor debate with the chair of the Ways and Means Committee about rebuilding that fund. But it is important that we're not depleting it completely because there's a temptation to do that. And we aren't doing that. And I think that's really important.
Well, tell us about the drought, because we just had a very rainy weekend, but drought is always an issue. And I understand there's something in this budget that can address our drought issues.
Well, there is. And so one of my frustrations has been that we tend to think about droughts when we're in them. And we don't use the time period between droughts to be proactive and think about what we can do to mitigate their effects. And so, as you probably know, I am chairing the North Shore Drought Task Force, and we are trying to get communities to work together and see if there are things that we can do together that might make sense that a single community could not do individually. Perfect example is trying to create more surface water storage, trying to create a reservoir or one or more reservoirs to be able to share in the community and capture water that's otherwise being lost. But in order to get there, you need to have a plan. And so I offered an amendment again. It passed for another $100,000 for Essex County to be able to come up with a first-class drought plan and put us on a path to sustainability. Now, there's still a lot of work to be done here, but I think it's critically important that we are not just waiting for the next drought to occur. And we've already had drought conditions actually this year,
Right.
but we need to be proactive, and these dollars will help us to do that.
Okay, last one, hate crimes.
So one of the things that's been concerning me a lot, and if we watch the news and read the newspaper and listen to the radio lately, we've seen not only an increase in hate crimes, but an increase in the intensity and the severity and some really heinous things that have happened. And so years ago, Governor Weld created a hate crimes task force, but that task force was created by executive order. So it does not have the power of statute, and it does not have permanence. And so I've been working at this for a couple of years, but in this year, the budget amendment that got passed makes that task force permanent and makes it statutory. And it also does something else. It adds legislators to the task force so that we can have advocates and folks of the communities that are affected by hate crimes. And we have legislators brought together in a permanent structure to have a continuing dialogue about what we can do to address the issue of hate crimes, because no one in our society, because of their attributes, should feel unsafe because of things like their race or their gender or their ancestry. That is just wrong. And so this task force hopefully will continue to be able to work to find ways that we can address this and we can eliminate, maybe ultimately, hopefully ultimately, hate crimes from our midst.
Hmm. So who would make up the task force? Just
So there are a number of different groups that are represented, interest groups that have been involved in these issues. So for instance, right now we're hearing a lot about Asian American Pacific Islander things that have happened that have been particularly bad. And so representatives from a group representing those folks, and groups that are from the Anti-Defamation League and other kinds of advocates would be brought together. And then the chairs of the respective committees in the legislature that have oversight over these kinds of issues would be on the task force with them, along with appointments that others would have in the legislature. So for instance, I would have an appointment and my House counterpart would have an appointment. And the idea is to have a broad-based, comprehensive, ongoing conversation.
That's wonderful. So what happens to the state budget now? Where is it at?
So we are at the point now where we have a Senate version of the budget and a House version of the budget that was passed back in April. Now, they are similar in some ways, but very different in others. And so we need to reconcile them. So what will happen next is a conference committee will be appointed with 3 members of the House and 3 members of the Senate, and they will work at that reconciliation. And that will happen very soon. I will have one appointment to that committee. And we will move forward. But my sense is that we're going to be able to reach agreement in a fairly expeditious way. There are certainly some contentious issues. One of them of note is the film tax credit, where the House has a very different position than the Senate. I actually happen to agree with the House position on this matter, but those things will need to get hashed out. And the goal is to have a new budget in place by July 1st, which is the beginning of the fiscal year. But in order for that to happen, it needs to get to the governor's desk, because the governor also will then have some time to veto or return certain items with amendments.
So June will be a busy month for that budget.
It surely will. And hopefully we'll have a new budget in place by July 1st. We don't always hit that target, but for the most part, we do. Sometimes we may go a few weeks later. There have been some rare examples when we've been significantly later than that. Hopefully, this won't be that type of situation, and we'll be able to get a new budget in place for the beginning of the fiscal year.
Great. Well, what are you working on next week?
So we're working on issues that relate to the emergency orders that were imposed because of the pandemic. So a couple of notable examples, things like outdoor dining for restaurants, which I have filed a bill to continue past the pandemic. Things like restaurants being able to deliver cocktails. Things like caps on price gouging and limits on delivery services that deliver food from restaurants, but also other things like being able to continue to have meetings with a virtual component. So there are a number of things, in fact, they're in the hundreds of things that were attached to the emergency public health order. And we're trying to sort through all of those things and not do them one at a time in a fragmented way, but try to, as best we can, look at all of them and decide in the next several weeks what's going to continue and what is not. And so right now, we've been taking testimony in the Senate, written testimony, and in fact, we still are until 5 o'clock today. This is Tuesday that we're taping, and so we'll be taking that testimony, and then for the rest of the week and into the next week and probably the following week, trying to sort out a game plan for what we need to do to continue some of these things and discontinue others.
Great. Well, I am voting for remote town meetings. I think that's been a great gift to the public.
There's a lot of discussion about that. I mean, there's certainly something to be said for town meeting where everyone is present and experiencing the same debate at the same time with each other. Certainly electronics can help us with that. But also there's the issue of accessibility, that for some folks that might not otherwise be able to get to a town meeting, being able to at least watch it remotely or participate remotely may have some advantages. So we're working on all of those things, and again, trying to be fair about it. And I would make a prediction that we will address some of these issues immediately, but others we'll probably be discussing for quite some time, because we're trying to assess what the so-called new normal is going to look like and learn the lessons of the pandemic and benefit from them.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to checking in again next week.
Well, thank you. I look forward to checking with you, and hopefully next week we'll have a report on, again, some of those things that involve the transition from the pandemic to the new normal, and look forward to talking with you then.
Great. Thank you.